Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things that happen here. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.
Coffee. Without it, we would never have had the Industrial Revolution. We'd all be still living in Europe in mud huts. Here in Laredo, we have the Organic Man Coffee Trike. 4501 McPherson, the best coffee on the planet. If you can't get to Laredo, you can order from the Organic Man Coffee Trike.shop. Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. Canada is still holding the lead, with Great Britain shortly behind them. Australia is in third, with Ghana and Sweden closing fast. If you feel bad because your country isn't in first place, spread the word. Tell your friends, your neighbors. The next time somebody leaves their cell phone unattended or their computer is on, type in my show and hit play. They may thank you later, or they may tell you to leave their stuff alone. I received this next subject from Inez. She used to work with me, or did I work with her? With Halloween just around the corner, it's time for some good old-fashioned ghost stories. I was going to focus on the Brown Lady, since I found dozens of sites that were all talking about her. Well, once I read what they had to say, I discovered there was little actual content to most of them. Everybody was mostly just repeating, word for word, what everybody else had said. So I switched over to ghost photos to make an hour show. Work was started at Rainham Hall in 1619 by Sir Roger Townsend. He was an untrained gentleman architect who was inspired by the works of Inigo Jones. The plans and the site were mostly dreamed up by the guy as he went. When they say gentleman, they're meaning super rich to the point that he didn't have to work for a living. He hired other people to sweat for him. Following the English Civil War, the family played an important part in the restoration of the monarchy in 1660. Sir Horatio Townsend, the younger brother of Sir Roger, accompanied the newly restored King Charles II back to England from the Netherlands. I don't understand the whole succession of kings and monarchs. Who told these people they were in charge of the planet? Sir Horatio first received the title of Baron and then Viscount. In 1671, Rainham Hall was visited by King Charles II, his younger brother James, Duke of York, and the royal entourage. The extensive park was over 800 acres. As the family estate passed from one generation to the next, it continued to grow. England has a long history of hauntings. With such a violent past, it's no wonder the place is overrun with spirits. Keep in mind, you don't have to have violent deaths to create ghosts. Plus, the fact some of the most violent places are relatively free of things that might keep you awake at night. The Somme was the bloodiest battle ever fought. Something around 3 million soldiers died on both sides of the conflict. Paranormal researchers visiting the area today are surprised by the relative lack of activity. Keep in mind, some of the bodies were never recovered. Some of them were never found, just bits and pieces from all those bombs blowing up. I get a kick out of how some folks will declare a site is haunted because someone was murdered there in the past. Ghosts seem to do whatever they want, regardless of what the experts say. The owners of Raynham Hall might not want visitors thinking they had ghosts. Maybe the staff was told to keep such talk to themselves. I couldn't find anything about when the first spirit was seen, but I found a lot about the most famous sightings. The Brown Lady is the Hall's most popular resident ghost, as she is believed to be the spirit of Lady Dorothy, the wife of Turnip Townsend, and the sister of Prime Minister Robert Walpole. I kind of wonder, where did he get that name, Turnip? Around 1713, Lady Dorothy Walpole married Charles Townsend. She was his second wife. Some stories say that Townsend became jealous of her previous lover, so he kept Dorothy locked in the house. She was kept out of the public view until her unexplained death in 1726. In another version of the story, Dorothy and Charles had a normal marriage until their 13th year. This was when Charles found out that Dorothy had been messing around with Lord Thomas Wharton before they tied the knot. Wharton had been a lazy, rich guy who ran up a lot of debt before fleeing the country. This pre-marriage fling caused Charles all kinds of mental issues, which led to him locking Dorothy in one of the rooms. And not even their children were allowed to see her. 1726, Dorothy was found dead, either from smallpox or maybe some unknown disease. The story of her death was soon followed by rumors. Dorothy was still alive, and the funeral had been just a facade. People began saying that Dorothy was still alive, locked away in some unused part of the mansion. Why was such a thing being whispered about? Staff were seeing a woman walking around late at night who looked just like her, as she was usually seen wearing a brown dress. When I was researching the little girl seen all over Laredo, a lot of folks didn't want to talk about their encounters until I mentioned how many others had also seen her. Once they found out they were not alone, the stories began to fly in. The same might be the case with the Brown Lady. The Prince Regent, George IV, saw her specter in 1815 while visiting the Raynham Hall. George III, who ruled from 1760 until 1820, this is the same guy that John Hancock was referring to when he signed his name big enough that King George could read it without his glasses, was troubled by periods of insanity that rendered him unfit to rule. Several times Parliament considered putting his son on the throne. George III would recover his facilities before the deed could be done. It finally became clear that George III was not fit to rule, and his son was established as Prince Regent from 1810 until 1820. Once George III was dead, his son George IV became king. People were seeing a woman in brown while visiting Raynham Hall. These were just stories passed from person to person, but still, they were just stories. Another recorded sighting of the ghost was by Lucia Stone during a gathering at Raynham Hall in Christmas, 1835. Stone says that Charles Townsend, this would be the grandson of Dorothy's husband, had invited various guests to the hall, including Colonel Loftus, for the Christmas festivities. Loftus and another guest named Hawkins said they had seen the brown lady one night as they were heading to their bedrooms, noting in particular the dated brown dress she was wearing. The following evening, Loftus said he had seen the brown lady once again, later reporting that on this occasion he was drawn to the specter's empty eye sockets, a dark in her glowing face. Loftus's sightings led to some of the staff leaving and never coming back. The next sighting of the brown lady was 1836 by Captain Frederick Marriott. He was a friend of the novelist Charles Dickens. He'd also written a few books of his own, mostly dealing with the sea. Marriott requested he be allowed to spend the night in a haunted room. He was out to prove that the stories of ghosts and the haunting was being augmented by the local smugglers who were wishing to keep people away from the area. To him, the brown lady was just a joke, just a story being told. On the wall of the bedroom that he was staying in was a painting of Lady Dorothy wearing that brown dress. Marriott told anybody that would listen that he was carrying a revolver and he was going to use it should the brown lady show herself. If anybody was dressing up to look like a ghost, there was going to be some violence if they didn't come clean. The first few nights went by without any visitations. The third night, things got interesting. Marriott had been talking to Townsend's two sons. They'd been talking about guns, and Marriott had showed them the one that he was carrying. As the three were heading to their bedrooms, they heard somebody coming along the hallway. They all stepped into a doorway, and they waited to see who was pretending to be the ghost. A woman in a long brown dress came along the hallway. She was carrying an old-style lantern. As she walked past the doorway, she stopped, turned, and stared right at Marriott. He jumped from behind the door and told the pretend ghost to identify themselves. The woman held the lantern up next to her face and gave Marriott a disturbing grin. It was both malicious and frightening. He fired point blank into her face. The brown lady simply vanished. After that, Marriott changed his ideas about the ghost being just a story. The ghost has also been seen right before tragic events and deaths that affected the Townsend family. One evening, during a dinner party, many guests had seen the apparition walking through the crowd. The specter did not seem to recognize anybody. It just simply moved through the room. The next morning, news of the death of George Walpole reached the group at the estate. George had died at the exact same time that everyone had seen the brown lady. September 19th, 1936, photographer Captain Hubert Provend, a World War I Army captain, and his assistant Indre Shira were taking pictures of Raynham Hall for the December issue of Country Life magazine. They were there to tell about the huge old house, not about ghosts. The captain was using a camera to photograph parts of the huge old mansion, while Indre took notes. The 35mm film camera was developed for use in motion pictures, what we would call a video today. Oscar Barnack, a development engineer for lights, first created his compact 35mm in 1913 in order to use 35mm film for still photography. Production was delayed during World War I. By the 1920s, the same film was being used in still cameras. These cameras were expensive and very few people could afford them. The old camera with the telescoping lens and the photographer's hood was still the go to camera for most people. Once the Leica 1 came out, the price came down and more people began using film cameras as opposed to the old plates. The story of Captain Provind and his assistant gets confusing as you look into it. A few sites claim the captain was using the old hood and tripod camera to take the photos. The operator would have to focus the camera by moving the lens in or out, put a glass plate into the camera, remove the lens cap to expose the image, and then cover it again so the plate didn't get overexposed. Lots of moving parts. This couldn't have been how the captain captured the photo of the brown lady. The story I found says the captain was taking photos inside the building. He set up at the bottom of the main staircase and he took a shot. He was using a tripod with a 35mm camera. Indra was standing next to him and saw something on the stairs. He told the captain to quick take another photo. The captain didn't see anything, but he hit the shutter button anyway. Later on, the pair were in the dark room developing their film. Once the film was in the wash tank, they saw an indistinct image forming on the stairs. The image looked like a woman coming down the stairs, but you can see right through her. The later investigations involving the film negative would not have worked had the captain been using the older style camera. There are a few different images out there of what people say is the captain's photo. The one I used on the event announcement looks like the one taken back in 1936. One site I visited had what they said was the brown lady photo. If you look at it, you'll notice the image on the stairs looks a lot like a statue of the Virgin Mary. To add to the confusion, there's a statue just around the corner from the staircase. The naysayers claim the captain used a double exposure to create the ghost photo. The image of the brown lady was taken to the editor of the Country Living magazine, who printed the story of how Raynham Hall was being haunted by the ghost of Lady Dorothy instead of the story of the people currently living there. As soon as the magazine hit the stands, the skeptics came forward trying to prove the photograph was a fake. Paranormal investigators examined the film and could find no evidence of a double exposure. The film hadn't been manipulated and the camera was not rigged to create the image. A paranormal investigator, Harry Price, interviewed the two men and he stated he could find no flaws in their story, as the negative also could not be proven to have been manipulated. The old house has a long history of pain and suffering, and people believe this is one of the many things which drawed tortured souls to it. During the Second World War, the British military requisitioned Raynham Hall, and the soldiers were allowed to live upstairs, while the Townsend family lived in the lower floors. They could find bullet holes in the ceiling and the walls on the floor where the soldiers had stayed. Why or what were these soldiers shooting at? I tried to find any reports of shots being fired at the mansion during the 1940s. All I can come up with was that some of these men housed there must have seen the brown lady and had some kind of a reaction similar to what Captain Marriott had when he shot at her in the hallway. It was either that or a whole bunch of what we call ADs, accidental discharges. I thought the gun was empty. I don't think there would have been that many ADs. After the first one, well, word would have gotten around, don't shoot up the mansion. The legend of the brown lady was not a product of this photograph, but had been part of the Norfolk lore for centuries. A ghost captured on film was something that had been constant presence at Raynham Hall since the 19th century. And here comes a cat to interfere with the show. Neptune. Another famous ghost photo is the Spectre of Newby Church. Britain has its fair share of famous ghost images. It would seem all you have to do is click a picture in any direction and you'll catch a spirit on film. Newby Hall, an 18th century house near Ripon in Yorkshire, is a tourist attraction and the scene of one of the most bizarre looking paranormal images from the 60s. The Newby monk, also known as the Spectre of Newby Church, is the name given to the ghostly apparition captured in a photograph taken on the grounds of Newby Hall Church of Christ the Counselor. That's quite a name. Reverend Kenneth Lord took the photograph in 1963. There was nobody standing in front of the altar when he took the photo. Once it was developed, the shape could be seen standing to the left of the main platform. This shape is dressed like an old-style monk. Some say it looks like an inquisitionist from the 1500s. Some of the folks inflicting torture on their fellow man would hide their faces using a mask so that nobody knew exactly who was doing this misdeed, who was causing the pain. Based on the height of the being standing in front of the handrail, it looks to be about 7 feet tall. The robe hangs all the way to the floor, and the face is covered with some kind of a mask. It looks like one of the masks used in the movie Scream. Some say the monk, if that's what he is wearing a face covering to conceal some disease caused disfigurement like smallpox or leprosy. Not everybody thought leprosy was contagious. King Baldwin IV, the king of Jerusalem, think of the movie Kingdom of Heaven, had leprosy, but he didn't hide away in some leper colony. A lot of his entourage also had leprosy, but they had contracted it long before meeting the king. Many of his guards had this condition as well. The photo of the Newby monk has been in books and magazines since it was first taken. Theories as to who it was and why his face looked the way it did were as numerous as crooked politicians. Many said this was some monk from the Inquisition haunting the church. Others said this was some monk unwilling to move on to the next plane of existence for unknown reasons. The church isn't all that old. It was built in 1876. No one has encountered any spirits in the church before or after that photograph was taken. April 1870, Frederick Viner and several other titled British and Italian tourists, think dukes and earls and such, were ambushed and kidnapped during their travels through Greece. A ransom was demanded for the release of the party. While a large portion of the funds were gathered for the group's release, the authorities attempted a quick hostage rescue. Well, things didn't go as planned, and 3 of the group, including Viner, were killed. Frederick's mother saw to it that the accumulated ransom was used in the construction of 2 churches in memory of her son. The first, Christ the Counselor, was built on her land at Newby, and the other on her sister's land at Studley Royal. I like that name, Studley. It reminds me of a guy I went through the academy with, the Stud Muffin. Well, that's another story. Not until Reverend Kenneth Lord took that famous photo, and not since has anyone reported seeing or hearing any paranormal activity. Remember, you don't need any kind of a violent death to draw spirits to a location. The ghost woman seen in the Laredo Arena is one example. We call these transient spirits. We don't know why some ghosts hang around in places. Old spooky buildings are sometimes just old buildings. New places filled with life in the daytime can take on a whole new atmosphere once the sun goes down. When a ghost is seen, the witnesses will try to associate the sighting with something that took place the same location years ago. That ghost looks like Abraham Lincoln, or it could be Gregory Peck. He played Captain Ahab in the 1956 movie Moby Dick. Take a look. Looks just like Abraham Lincoln, but it's not. On another slant of the ghost image, what if the elementals take on the looks of somebody associated with the location so they can trick people into lowering their guard, thinking, oh, that's just the spirit of a long dead ancestor? That's how the story of The Exorcist got started. The young boy thought he was communicating with his dead aunt, when in fact he was allowing a demon into his home and then his body. Some folks swear every ghost out there is a demon in disguise. I know too many psychics who have had decent interaction with ghosts to write them off as all being bad. Sometimes a ghost is just a ghost. You do have to be a bit paranoid to be a ghost hunter. Keep your guard up while at the same time trying to interact with those from another dimension. The Nubai monk may have simply been passing through on his way to some other location when Reverend Lord took that photo. The former Toys R Us in Sunnyvale, California was the home of a ghost for years. Reports of ghostly activity began shortly after the Bay Area store was constructed in 1970. Employees said they would see dolls flying off the shelves and balls bouncing down the aisles. When they were alone, they could feel a cold breeze on the back or hear a disembodied voice calling their name. Some witnesses reported being touched by an invisible hand. The phenomenon became common enough to warrant a visit from a medium. Sylvia Brown brought her psychic abilities to the store to look into the reports. She conducted a seance in the building in late 1970s. During the ritual, she said she sensed the spirit of a Swedish preacher named Johnny Johnson who had worked on the land that became the city of Sunnyvale. While helping out on the Murphys' farm in the 1880s, he fell in love with the family's daughter, Elizabeth. Well, she didn't much take to him, and she ran off with a lawyer from the East Coast. Johnson's sad story met with a tragic end when he was injured while chopping down trees in the forest. He was unable to get help, and he slowly bled to death. Brown revisited the Toys R Us to communicate with Johnson on many occasions. She called him the most stubborn, ornery, argumentative ghost she'd ever met. In her book, The Other Side and Back, she said, "I've tried many times to explain to him that his lifetime as Johnny Johnson had ended. He finally got so tired of my nagging him about it that he gave me an ultimatum. If you tell me I'm dead one more time, I'm not going to talk to you anymore." Brown let the matter drop. As she and the ghost had a quasi-friendship on which they found other things to talk about, including the annoying and noisy kids who frequented the store. While the Murphys and their farm were real, other details of Brown's account didn't add up. Some say that Elizabeth didn't elope with a lawyer. She married the son of a wealthy businessman in 1863. She is supposed to have died in 1875, years before Johnson even worked on the farm. Regardless, ghost stories surrounding the Sunnyvale Toys R Us persisted. The business was thrust into the national spotlight when it was featured on the reality show That's Incredible in 1980. The episode included a seance with Brown and most compelling piece of evidence in the case. Lots of photographs were taken while inside the store. In one of these photos, a figure can be seen in the background leaning against the wall. The people in the foreground are unaware of him. When investigators looked at the film captured at the same time and the same place, the figure was not in any of the film. The Sunnyvale Toys R Us continued operating for decades before closing permanently in 2018. It wasn't long before all of their stores had closed. The next year, the building hosted a business that was a little bit more in keeping with the ghost inside. It became a spirit Halloween. I wonder if any ghostly activity was ever seen inside the Halloween store. My favorite ghost video was taken at an old abandoned hospital here in Laredo. What makes it my favorite is I was there when it happened. The LPRS had permission to be in the building. Unlike many self-proclaimed investigators, we were there with the blessings of the owner as well as the police. There were several cops in our group that night. This was the fourth or the fifth time the LPRS held an investigation inside this old hospital. We assembled at the main entrance, right next to the gift shop. I remember what the place was like back when it was still filled with patients and medical staff. I did my paramedic rotations there while I was in training. The morgue was in the basement just down the hall from the cafeteria. Ishmael led a bunch of us downstairs and we headed towards the morgue. There had been activity there in the past and we were hoping there would be some more tonight. Ishmael was wearing a brand new pair of full spectrum glasses with a 6-hour recording ability. If you're walking around using a regular camera, you have to keep looking from the front of you to the screen so you don't trip over something. This can make ghost hunting a bit of a challenge. With what I call the cool guy glasses, Ishmael didn't have to look at the camera. He was recording everything that happened right in front of him. He was leading the group. I was to his right, and two guys were to his left. We were passing a door that used to lead into the kitchen. Surprisingly, a lot of cooking equipment is still in there. Something caught Ishmael's eye as he turned to ask if I'd seen anything. As he turned towards me, he asked, "Did you see?" And then he began to cough. I looked at him, hoping he'd be okay. The place is full of dust and nasty stuff left behind by people that were sneaking around in there when they shouldn't have been. As soon as Ishmael caught his breath, he said he'd seen movement to my right. We looked around to see if there was anything there. There was a metal piece of conduit hanging down from the ceiling, and we just guessed that that's what he'd seen. We continued on to the morgue. Nothing happened the rest of the night. No voices, no images, nothing cool and spooky. Once home, Ishmael hooked his glasses up to the computer to download the video. It got interesting from there. In the video, you can see the hallway leading to the morgue. The view moves as Ishmael turns in my direction. As his view passes a huge doorway, the one going to the kitchen, a black shape can be seen in the room. It was just a bit darker than the surrounding room. Light from our flashlights was spilling in. The black shape rushes out, and that was when Ishmael began to cough. I was standing right next to the door, but I didn't see what was caught on the video recorder. As you walk around in the dark, your eyes will detect all kinds of movement. Little changes in the black will look like things are moving. This is subtile. You're barely able to recognize what your eyes are witnessing. If Ishmael hadn't had those glasses, the shape would have been written off as just our imagination. I'll bet we watched that recording 100 times. A few years later, the LPRS was invited to give a presentation for Halloween at the McAllen Library. We drove down and we showed some of our best paranormal images. As the video from the hospital hallway was playing, a woman sitting in the middle of the room said she saw a face in the doorway. Ishmael stopped the video and he ran it back. He played it forward at a very slow speed, then an even slower speed. Finally, the video was going at about 1 frame at a time. In just one shot, a face can be seen. It looked like a skull with a black cloak hanging down around it. How this woman was able to catch that face or this skull in just 1 frame is beyond me. She did tell us that she had some abilities. She was able to see things that the rest of us couldn't. As she told Ishmael, there was somebody standing on the stage right behind him. He tried using a tri-field meter, but we didn't find anything. Unlike some TV shows, when weird things happen, none of us yell or run around. Now, that's mostly Hollywood doing what they think people want to see. The owner of the old hospital will prosecute, so don't go inside unless you have permission to be there. That and the fact that there's asbestos in some parts of the place. If you don't want health problems, don't go in. I just heard some really weird rumble. I don't know what it was. It sounded like a jet passing right over the house. Anyway, if you do want to go inside, get with someone that has permission to be there or get with the owner. But good luck on that. In 1924, James Courtney and Michael Meehan were... Okay, now my cat's bumping my camera. In 1924, James Courtney and Michael Meehan were crew members aboard the SS Watertown. As the ship was en route to Panama Canal from New York, they were assigned to clean out the cargo tanks. This was a common practice. Oil tankers had to be cleaned from time to time, and it was a quick trip to the Panama Canal, so they were going to do it while en route. You might say safety was taking a back seat to everything else. That's how things used to be done. Neptune is bumping up against the camera. That's why it keeps bouncing around. Today, we are being handcuffed by so many safety regulations. It's getting to a point that, well, if anything does bad happen, usually it's on purpose. The 2 men were inside the hold when gases overcame them. The hatches were open. Any gas should have escaped. Well, nobody thought that there were gases that were heavier than air. Well, we know about these today. Being away from port, the 2 men were given a burial at sea. This is a tradition from way back during the times of sailing ships. The men would be sewn into a canvas bag along with enough weight to take them to the bottom. As the ship continued sailing for the canal, men on watch began reporting seeing 2 ghostly figures following the ship. The heads of 2 men could be seen in the waves. So many people saw these two that the captain had a man assigned to stand by the rail with a camera to see if he could get a photograph. The image of two heads bobbing alongside the ship can plainly be seen. These specters continued following the ship for days. Eventually, the crew rotated out to another ship, and the two heads were no longer seen following the water town or any of the other ships, as far as we know. The Gray Lady has been haunting Hampton Court Palace. She's not alone. There are lots of ghosts in that building, but she's the one that became famous. Other spirits have been seen or heard in the 500-year-old building. A Dame Syble Penn was the head servant working at the court for years. The title Dame was given to a woman being equivalent in rank to a knight. A Dame Sybil took care of several monarchs who lived at Hampton Court. After taking care of Elizabeth I, who was suffering from smallpox, Sybil contracted the disease herself and died in 1562. Her spirit seemed content to rest in peace until the chapel was damaged during a storm. As the building was being renovated, Sybil's tomb was relocated to a new burial site in 1829. Once the tomb was moved, people began hearing strange noises as if a person was working a spinning mill or wheel. The sound was heard through a wall, but nobody could find anybody busy working wool or cotton. People also reported seeing a woman dressed in a gray dress walking around the corridors and hallways. The sound of the spinning wheel was heard by so many people, and an investigation was put forth. This led to the discovery of a previously unknown room. At some point in the past, a hallway was replastered and a door was simply plastered over. The unknown room contained a well-worn antique spinning wheel and all of the things that you needed to spin wool. People working at the palace have felt cold hands touching them either on the shoulder or sometimes on their face. The sudden cold hand is felt, but nobody has seen. Some folks have been allowed to spend the night in one of the many bedrooms. They will awaken suddenly in the night after some cold entity seems to have entered the room. The temperature will suddenly drop by dozens of degrees. Both staff and visitors have seen and heard things, but it wasn't until 2003 that a photograph showed up. A set of doors leading out to the yard suddenly would pop open. A camera mounted outside would capture the doors swinging open, but there was no one there to have opened them. The doors opened on camera for many months. One day, the camera caught a tall, dark figure, dressed in what looked like a monk's cloak, reach out through the open doors and pull them shut. The figure was never identified as being one of the staff or anybody touring the building. The outfit was very distinct. Anyone walking around the building before or after the door incident would have been noticed. In 2022, two young girls were touring the palace. In the king's apartment, one of the girls, 12-year-old Holly, took a couple photographs of her cousin, 12-year-old Brooke, as she was standing in front of the display. In the first photo, Brooke is facing the display, and then in the next shot, she turns and smiles for the camera. Nothing odd to see there, and the two girls moved on to the next room. Once the two tweens were back home, Holly was showing Brooke the photos, and that's when they noticed something. As the image of Holly was being snapped in the king's apartment, a woman could be seen standing almost immediately behind Brooke. The woman was dressed in a floor-length gray dress. Holly snapped several pictures in a row. The woman is in one photo, but not the next. Had this mystery woman walked away, she would still have shown up in the second or third photo. The way the woman was dressed, combined with her hairstyle, led people to believe that Holly had managed to take a photograph of the Gray Lady, a Dame Syble Penn. If you'd like to capture a photograph of a ghost, good luck. Ghosts and spirits don't respond on demand. You can go to the most haunted location in the area and snap photos all day and all night and never catch anything from beyond the grave. Ghost photos happen when nobody's expecting them. All of the image I've gone over, with the exception of the Watertown ghosts, were found to have spirits after the photos were being examined. The photographers were taking pictures of other things, and the spirit just kind of photobombed them. If you want to catch a ghost in a photo, you have to take lots of photos of everything and then look them over and see what you catch. Not every ghostly looking image is going to be a ghost. You might just catch a reflection through glass or off of some object in the place you're working. To rule out any accidents, the best thing to do is take several photos. You stay aimed on what you're shooting and click the shutter a few times. This is the age of digital photography. Back when you had to use film, you were limited on how much film you had. 24 or 36 shots was the norm. Once the roll was full, you had to send it out to be developed, unless you had the equipment in your bathroom. If an entity did show up, you had to hope the technician didn't trash the image saying the photo was no good. They did that sometimes. If you were lucky, you'd still get the negatives back. I took a bunch of photos at Dolores, down south of town, a 35 millimeter film. I sent the film in to be developed. I got 15 of the 36 images back. They said the film was no good and the images didn't turn out. The negatives were all black. I wonder, did the technician tell the truth? Or did I catch something on the film and he just assumed it was bad photography? Today you can click away as you please and not have to worry about paying for developing. Just hook up your camera and review the images at your leisure. If you don't see anything odd, you can store your images away without incurring any extra cost. If you do find something interesting, you can enlarge the image to see what might have been there when you click the picture. October 5th, 2018, the LPRS was conducting guest ghost hunts at the Laredo College, formerly known as Fort McIntosh. The fort had been an Army base from 1853 until 1946. When it was decommissioned, the land was turned over to Laredo to be used as a junior college. Many of the buildings from the Army days are still there. The old hospital, the guardhouse, the stables, and the chapel. On the first night, we went to the chapel to entertain and scare our guests. Well, nobody actually got scared. They did have a good time. One of our crew was walking around on his own. He took photos of things as he went, just getting a feel for the investigation. Once he'd had enough, he hooked his camera up to the computer and had a look. Nothing much until he came to photos of the front door. He'd been standing inside on the upper floor, shooting down a half floor. The image shows somebody standing right next to the doors. If you zoom in, you can see the molding through the person. This, combined with the fact that there was nobody standing there when he took the picture, well, we're pretty sure this is a ghost of someone. At the end of each tour, Ishmael would take a photo of the group. This was for our archives. While in Arechiga Hall, a group of 15 guests posed in front of the painting of Domingo Arechiga, the first president of the college. Ishmael snapped a few photos and the guests went on their way. Later, the images were being looked over. Something odd turned up. There is a hallway running back behind the guests. Standing in the far back corner, you can see a small figure right in the corner. The figure is about the size and shape of a young girl. Zooming in, you can see right through her. During this month-long investigation on Fridays and Saturday nights, there were maybe 100, 200 guests. We used cameras, both video and still. Thousands of images were taken. The best ghost photos were taken when nobody was expecting to see anything. It is bizarre how on so many occasions ghosts are caught in pictures when the people photographed as well as the person doing the shooting are unaware of an extra presence in the group. Sometimes it might be just a body part, an extra arm or a hand, and nobody belongs to it. On other times, an entire person will be found in a photo. When there's nobody or no other person at the time that the image was taken. Ghosts and spirits can be photographed. When and how, well, that's just a guess. People have caught images in all kinds of locations and under many different conditions. Lightning storms do seem to make them more photogenic. The extra energy in the air helps bring out their images. Then again, ghosts have been photographed in abandoned buildings with only the power source being the camera or the person taking the photo. The best way to ensure you catch a being from beyond is to take as many photos as you can all the time and everywhere that you are, and then give them a very close scrutiny. You have to put them on your computer and blow them up and take a really close look at all the images. Lots of bizarre things have been found months or even years after the camera was used. Hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, tell your friends and neighbors and even people that don't even know you what they're missing. If you'd like to buy a t-shirt, you can find all kinds of weird things at tpublic.com. And if you'd like a book or two, you can find my books at Amazon.com or at the Organic Man Coffee Trike on McPherson. Until next Saturday, this is Chris James for Strange Things.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? This ain't murder three. Strange things that happen here, no stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.